Good afternoon. This is Aisha Salman, ASA's Business Intelligence Analyst here. I would like to welcome all the attendees that are tuning in, including our special guests from the National Association of Electrical Distributors. This is the fifth and final part of our series of COVID-19 economic impact webinars. Before we get started, ASA would like to thank all of its supplier partners for their continued support of the association and its efforts. In today's webinar titled COVID in the Rear View, Dr. Kuehl will shed light on if we think we have really turned the corner by this time. What can we reasonably expect as far as recovery? Which sector will lead and which will lag? Dr. Kuehl has a doctorate in political economics and advanced degrees in Soviet and Asian studies and is also a co-founder of Armada Corporate Intelligence. In addition to being ASA's chief economist, Dr. Kuehl does the same for a number of other associations. He is also the editor of the Business Intelligence Brief and a primary writer for the Black Owl Report. The webinar will last 40 to 45 minutes. We will open the floor to questions and answers at the end. Please post your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar window toward the bottom. We will try to get to as many questions as possible today. Over to you, Chris.
All right, thank you very much. And as we launch bravely ahead and talk about the recovery, at least that's the theory, I think we are in a position where things will begin to improve, but it's going to be somewhat contingent. As I started out, oh God, it feels like 25 years ago that we started doing these. It just seems like time has dragged. We talked a lot about the black swan concept, and now I'm thinking we're seeing a flock of black swans. It's like, and I'm tired of those birds. I would like to see them go away. Almost every day brings a new iteration, and that's kind of what we expected. And most of the news has been better than we anticipated. We are learning more about the virus every day. It begins to look more and more like the viruses we are familiar with every day. Doesn't really make it any easier to contend with, but it begins to give us some ideas of what we do in the future. The whole challenge from the very start was that we really didn't understand where this came from in terms of how it entered the human host and blah, blah, blah. Now we know that it is more flu-like than we thought, and that gives us some clue as to how we will contend with it as we go forward. And that's important because now we're in the process of reopening, and we're trying to figure out how quickly we can do this, whether we're going to have to reverse course and go back to the isolation policies of the past, et cetera. So the more we know about this, the better. I'm not going to pretend to be an epidemiologist. I'm not even going to pretend to be a doctor. I'm going to leave that to others and talk more from the economic perspective, where at least I have a modicum of expertise. So when you look at the politics of COVID-19, which is now playing a pretty powerful role, a partisan divide has erupted, as it seems to erupt over everything. There is basically a division as to what we should be emphasizing. Should we be dealing with the economy, or should we be dealing with the epidemic? As we have talked about many times before, it's really hard to do both. Anything that you do to improve the opportunity for the economy to recover risks making the epidemic worse. Anything you do to control the epidemic tends to make the economy worse. We've seen a pretty dramatic shift of power to the governors, which is not terribly surprising. When it comes right down to it, an awful lot of the day-to-day practical stuff that happens in the country happens at the state and local level. You know, we kind of lose sight of that to a degree because national coverage is always Washington, D.C., but when you're kind of in the trenches, and most businesses know this very well, the majority of the decisions that matter the most are local. They're going to be everything from zoning decisions to infrastructure decisions to taxation decisions, regulatory decisions. They're all much more prevalent at the local level than they are really at the national. The election year is something we've talked about a little bit before, and nothing particularly has changed when it comes to elections, whether it's talking this year or elections we've had in the past. By the time you get to the election year itself, usually a third of the public has already made up its mind to support the incumbent. A third has made up its mind to support the opposition. And that's the case we have now. I mean, roughly a third people are going to vote Trump no matter what. Roughly a third are going to vote against him no matter what. And they made their minds up years ago. They haven't changed one iota. What really matters is the behavior of the crucial middle third, and they're going to react according to what's happening the day of the election. They're going to determine if they are in good shape or bad shape. If they're in good shape, they will tend to credit the incumbent, whoever that is, whether it's a governor, senator, mayor, representative, president. It's the incumbent that will get the reward. If they're not in good shape, they will tend to punish the incumbent. And that it doesn't matter whether it's governor, president, or mayor. We've definitely seen a bigger role for government, and along with that has come future problems. I mean, our debt and deficit were issues before. If we do actually see yet another stimulus coming out of Congress, there's talk of another $3 trillion stimulus. We will have a deficit that is 120% of our GDP, our $20 trillion GDP. That is massive. And it is going to have I mean, it's been massive for years. It's not like it's changed. It just gets more massive and more difficult to deal with. We're also dealing globally with a trust gap, and this is something that is going to play into how well we recover. There are lots of countries that are skeptical of their leadership right now, and not necessarily that they don't believe them. It's just that they're getting contradictory messages from within that government, and they don't quite know what to accept. So Trump has lost some credibility. So has Boris Johnson in the UK. Emmanuel Macron in France, even Xi Jinping in China have seen their support wane because the public is just not sure of the message that they're getting. Should we be coming back? Should we not? Who am I listening to? There have been leaders that have gained. Angela Merkel in Germany has continued to gain in her credibility. Sebastian Kurz has kind of come out of nowhere as far as the Austrians are concerned. He's the Austrian chancellor. And President Moon in South Korea has been gaining credibility. But that's playing a fairly dramatic role in many countries right now. Um, the issues that will dominate the election, it's going to be COVID-19 to the max. I mean, we're seeing that develop now. It will become a lot more intense by the time we get into October, November, and there will be a variety of questions. Should there have been a lockdown at all? Are we going to go back and look at what happened and say it wasn't worth it? That the economy was too badly damaged and we didn't get the advantage we thought we would? Should the lockdown have been more aggressive? Should we have been more insistent when it came to containment and isolation? What could have been done to prepare for this? There'll be a lot of conversation about that. Should we have been ready? Should we have better testing? Should we have had better tracking? Should we have better treatment options? What should we do in the future? Is there going to be a repeat of this? Are we going to see it again in the coming years? Will we see another kind of viral outbreak? Should more money go to public health? We've spent an incredible amount of money lately, but it's mostly a kind of a temporary fix, trying to help the medical sector deal with the immediate concerns. But we have not spent a great deal of money on public health in the past, and that may be something that will be changed. People will certainly talk about it. What should be done to deal with the debt and deficit? I think a lot of people will run away from this question because the only options are reduce spending and increase revenue, and neither one of those are popular political positions. Is there anything else that needs to be done to get the economy back on track? There's going to be lots of ideas. Many of them will be kind of silly or fundamentally ineffective, but it will be something that a lot of politicians will be gearing up to talk about. And then what relationship should we have with China and, for that matter, the world from this point? China has become, to a large degree, the bad guy for the entire world. It's not just us. The Australians are threatening to sue them. The Japanese are angry at them. The Europeans have been picking on them. And China now is starting to respond in kind. The latest kind of series of moves from Chinese diplomats has been described as the return of the wolf warriors. This is a concept that kind of comes out of Chinese theater. There's a lot of movies in China that feature this same theme. They're extremely popular in the movie houses throughout China, which is brave special forces from the Chinese military fighting foreign mercenaries in a variety of ways, and they're referred to as wolf warriors. And the theme is always the same: that the evil Westerners and the evil, you name it, trying to destroy China. And the majority of the time, these threats have been American, European, Japanese, and occasionally some random other, just to sort of mix it up a little. But China is getting to the point where it's counterattacking when it comes to the responsibility. We keep saying, or Trump keeps saying, that this was developed by China and it was China's fault. The Chinese are now saying, no, this was developed by the Americans to destroy us. And they deliberately planted COVID-19 in our country. So the conspiracy theorists are having a field day with both of these countries. We've shown this slide before. It's the trade-off. Won't go over it in detail again, but it's the fundamental problem. Anything you do to deal with the epidemic means that you have further delayed the recovery of the economy. Everything you do to accelerate the economic recovery makes the pandemic potentially worse. There's no magic bullet. There's no policy that addresses both of them equally. So people end up having to make a choice, and that creates tensions for obvious reasons. A couple of things just to put stuff in context. 2008 was still a worse recession than this one, even though the numbers are brutal. And the reason for that is that when we went into the recession in 2008, it was a traditional recession. We went into it the way we go into all recessions. We had a period of ridiculous growth prior to the recession. We had the housing boom. We had all kinds of indicators that the economy was unbalanced. We remember Alan Greenspan and his reference to irrational exuberance. The economy tipped over the edge, went into crisis, and ended up with a lingering problem for many, many years. We did not truly recover from that recession until probably 2015, 2016. And you can see by the chart, we kept seeing down quarters. We kept seeing periods where the economy was faltering. It wasn't really until about 2016 that we got consistent growth, where we didn't start dropping every couple of quarters. And that's kind of the indication that we had finally recovered from 2008. This one obviously is showing much worse numbers for Q1 and Q2. Couldn't help but do that. I mean, the entire economy was shut down. There was no preparation, no warning, no announcement that a recession was imminent. It just was declared, and suddenly we're in terrible shape. If we get what we hope we get in May and June, you get a reopening almost by the same tool. You know, we shut the economy down by edict. Now we're going to reopen the economy by edict. That the states are basically going to say, as of today, we are open. Here are the rules. Here are the ways that you're going to have to open. But as of today, we are open. It's not a matter of the economy having recovered to a point that business starts to get back into the swim of things, which is what they had to do in 2008, 2009. That recession stretched over several quarters. This one probably won't if we get the rebound that we hope we get. Global cost has been extreme, and it depends on which of your scenarios you're kind of keying off of. There's the fast recovery, which is basically the May-June rebound. There's the delayed cure, which is kind of a end of summer, beginning of fall type discussion, and then you've got the profound recession, which is something that lasts through 2020 into 2021. And the numbers are grim. I mean, if you take it all the way out to that profound recession, China 2.5% growth, the European Union down by 2.5 points, the U.S. down by 1.5 points. If, however, you're dealing with a fast recovery, well, China is hanging in there, about 5.6%. The U.S. is back to the numbers that it had at the beginning of this year and probably improving into 2021. So there's a big gap between the worst case scenario and the best case scenario, and we're just going to have to watch how the consumer and the business community responds in the next 2 to 3 weeks. The economy is getting hit from all different directions, and that's part of what makes this complicated in terms of predicting what sectors come back at what rate. Households have been affected, government has been involved at a lot of different levels, even as the states and the local communities have had more and more responsibility for dealing with this. Their revenues have been cut, and their ability to respond has been severely limited. They're not getting the kind of taxation revenue that they had been, and they won't for a while because they are heavily dependent on things like sales taxes. So, and the fact that this is a global concern means that there's no rival country out there that's playing the role of engine. Usually in a recession, there's some country somewhere that really isn't getting hit as hard, and they end up becoming the engine to bring the whole world economy back. This time, there isn't one of those, but potentially, as you get recovery at uneven paces, if, for example, the Asian states rebound a little faster because they got hit earlier and have gotten to the point of rebuilding earlier, you could see China and perhaps Japan, perhaps some of the other Korea, Vietnam, the others playing a little bit of that engine role, and then eventually Europe begins to kick in, and then we get to kick in. But that's still somewhat of a conjecture. Here's the critical discussion as far as where we go and how we are proceeding and what people's level of optimism is. This is something that is coming out of the EU itself, and it's consistent with what we're seeing from the OECD, from the IMF, from the World Bank, from most of the major financial institutions. They all looked at 2019 and said, look, 2019 was not a banner year. It was a very anemic growth year anyway. We went into 2020 weak, and we went into 2020 with the assessment that we were probably going to hit a recession of some kind anyway. It wasn't going to be a deep one like this one, but it was going to be a recession nonetheless. The prediction that existed before the COVID-19 pandemic was that 2020 was going to be probably a little weaker than 2019, maybe even to negative territory, and by 2021, maybe back to where they were in 2019. So a very weak period of growth. Not a disastrous recession like this, but very anemic. Now, the expectation is a deep decline in 2020, followed by a dramatic recovery in 2021. This is a classic V recession. This is going down in a hurry and then coming back in a hurry and getting what you normally get out of a V. What happens traditionally is that weaker companies go out of business and open up market share for stronger companies that come back in the following recovery. And those companies that survive in better shape than those that went by the wayside during the recession. They gain market share, they are in a position to hire the best workers, they are more in control of the demand factors than they had been before. Think back to 2008, particularly in construction. And many of you remember that well. This is a critical area for ASA people. But remember what happened in that period, 2006, 2007. I mean, just in my own community, using that as an example, Kansas City is not exactly one of the world's largest cities. We at one time had over 500 home builders in a city the size of Kansas City. I mean, we're less than 3 million people in the entire metropolitan area. 500 home builders. Because during the home building boom, all you needed was a hammer and a tool belt, and by God, you were a home builder. And people were throwing them up all over the place, and people were paying ridiculous prices, and it was just, Katie bar the door. After the 2008 recession, we had 11. It's like the ne'er-do-wells and the guys that used to work for Quick Trip and now decided to be a home builder were gone. And the ones that were left behind were the real home builders. And they, in turn, saw good growth for the next several years because the landscape had been cleared out and the demand now was being met by people that were in a position to actually meet it. So that process happens frequently with V-shaped recessions. Same thing if you just look at the IMF's data on the globe. These numbers are really quite stunning. I mean, you're looking at growth in the United States of 4.7. We have not seen 4.7% growth in the United States for over a decade. I mean, we're going back to the beginning of the century to get growth that good. Euro the euro area growing at nearly 5%, that hasn't happened in 2 decades. The Middle East, 4%. The emerging markets, this is China. I mean, that's China going back to the sort of hyper growth that it had 2 decades ago. Latin America growing at 3.4. These are all, of course, suppositions. I mean, we can't foresee the future that accurately, but they're all based on the same assumption that when you get a recovery, you are going to get a recovery with what amounted to a purged economy. You're going to have more opportunity for well-run companies. You're going to see, I mean, not to be insulting about it, and I'm not casting aspersions on anyone, but most of the companies that are participant with ASA, you know that one of the problems you've been having for the last several years is workforce. You couldn't find the people you needed. You could not find the skills you needed. You were coping the best you could. You were hiring people who were unskilled, untrained, unmotivated, and trying to make good workers out of them. You were trying to replace people with machines. You were doing everything in your power to try to upgrade your workforce, but you were watching your productivity suffer year after year because they weren't the workers you really wanted. Well, I mean, one of the things that happens when you see a massive number of people lose their jobs is some very talented people are suddenly on the market and looking for opportunities. You can now, as an employer, for probably the first time in 10 years, you can be picky. You can start to look at the number of people who are applying for jobs and saying, well, I'm no longer having to choose from the three guys that happen to wander into the store one day. I'm not looking at a pile of applications that's, like four deep. Now, I mean, 30 million people lost their jobs. In that group, there may be people I want to hire, and it's not a popular position, but prior to this recession, it was an employee's market. It is now an employer's market, and that's radically different from what it's been literally since the last recession. The recovery will see a increase, we'll see opportunity. The big question for a lot of businesses is how long it's going to take them to recover from that big drop. And when it comes down to the practical matter, there's been a lot of damage done. And even if we get growth in June and July and August, there's been a lot of damage done. And it's going to be a while before we erase that damage. I mean, we saw a 40% drop, and it's going to be a while before we see a return to normal. A lot of businesses are going to be licking their wounds for a while. The oil market, of great interest to ASA. This is not the first time oil prices have dropped. This has been a very predictable drop. We know exactly why oil prices went down. Early in this crisis, we had the complication of Russia, Saudi Arabia, other OPEC members deliberately trying to lower oil prices and deliberately step up production, trying to put pressure on the oil market in the United States. That went by the wayside. They weren't able to do that for terribly long. Now this is strictly demand. We just are not seeing demand anywhere. It's not here, it's not Europe, it's not Asia, and that demand has been striking. We saw a 56% decline over 7 months. But look back, there was a 54% decline in the 3 month period back in 2014. I mean, so we saw similar types of decline in the oil market for things that were not nearly this dramatic. I mean, just had to do with the classic fact that oil is an inelastic good. We simply use what we use, and price honestly doesn't play that big a role. When you think about how people have reacted to oil prices and gasoline prices in the past, we complain bitterly when the price of gasoline goes to $3, $3.50, $4, but do we really change what we consume? For the most part, no. We don't have a choice. Just because the price of gas went up to $4 doesn't mean that you can suddenly quit your job and no longer commute. Just because the price of gas goes up doesn't mean that your trucking company can start pushing the truck down the road to save fuel. We use what we use, and we like it when the prices are low. We don't like it when the prices are high, but our consumption doesn't change. I mean, right now, gas prices are ridiculously low because demand is down. It does not mean 35 a gallon. I'm now going to commute 400 miles out of my way just because it's cheap and I can do it. Nope, we're going to drive the same as we've always driven. You look historically, the prices have bounced all over the place. There have been price collapses. You've got the beginning of the shale oil revolution, global demand spike in 2008. Now, that's significant in and of itself because that was a response to the hypergrowth that was taking place in 2008. That's part of what set up that 2008 recession. And then you saw the Great Recession. In the space of less than a year, the price per barrel of oil collapsed. Then the shale boom became an issue. I mean, we've seen this roller coaster in oil for a long time. The predictions are still that when we see demand come back towards the end of the summer, beginning of fall, the possibility of $100 a barrel oil is very real. And this is based on the assumption that oil producers will have really ratcheted down between now and then. And then when the demand does come back, they're going to come back relatively slowly. Some won't be able to because they actually went out of business and shut down altogether. Others will, we've seen it before. It's like if we take our time coming back, we'll be able to charge more money and we can start to recoup some of our losses. People are demanding oil again. And if we keep the short supply in position, we can make up some of what we lost earlier in the year. We've seen this before. The industry as a whole, all the different countries are not in a huge hurry sometimes to meet that additional demand until they get the prices up where they want them. The stock markets have pretty much gone back to normal behavior. They obviously dropped significantly in March. But again, this is one of those things where we have to look at what the world was like prior to the outbreak. Most of the market analysts were saying that this was going to be the year of the big correction, that the markets were overvalued. I mean, go back and read the kind of stuff that was being discussed in January, February, last December, last November. I mean, people were getting on CNBC and everything else under the sun saying, we are overvalued. It has to correct. We must get back to normal. Well, we did. It was a little more sudden than people were anticipating it would be, but it hit rock bottom in March, has come back since, and has been behaving like the market usually does. It goes up on certain news, it goes down on certain news. Some of it makes sense, some of it doesn't. Like today, you saw the markets responding not particularly enthusiastically to the decisions being made in California. And California is going to extend the isolation policies a little longer than they had originally planned. They are now, excuse me, talking about keeping the universities shut all the way through next year. But even those types of decisions may change and alter. I mean, one of the things that followed almost immediately on that announcement in California was a group of students suing the university system and saying, yeah, you're going to close schools for a year and make us do all of our work online. You are you? Not at the tuition you're charging me now, you're not. If you expect me to pay that kind of money and I don't see a professor except on my laptop screen and I don't see any fellow students and I don't get any of the college experience, I ain't paying that. And all of a sudden, you're getting a lot of discussion among lawyers saying, yeah, you're not delivering what you said you were going to deliver. So that's grounds for a lawsuit. Um, we've got people now that are looking at the cable companies saying, you know, the reason I pay that exorbitant price for cable is to get sports. And if you think watching a 20-year-old football game is a replacement for what I do with cable TV, you're wrong, and I don't want to pay that anymore. And so all of a sudden, the cut the cable crowd is really accelerating because it's like, what am I paying for? You're not delivering. I mean, I realize maybe it's not your fault, but hey, so that's going to be interesting to watch. The global workforce could lose as much as $3.4 trillion in income this year. That's the high estimate. The low estimate is not quite that brutal, but it's not particularly exciting. And the issue there is how well do countries succeed when that income is yanked out of the consumer class? The U.S. is in a kind of a weird position when it comes to income right now, and a lot of you are experiencing this problem. The first thing that happened was, of course, an extension of unemployment benefits and trying to figure out a way to cushion people from the loss of jobs. We're looking at around 30 million lost jobs, even though we know that some 80% of those jobs are probably more furlough than actual layoff. These are people who will be brought back as quickly as the companies reopen. I mean, they have no choice. The companies cannot function without those employees, and they will hire them back. But you still have some 20% that have legitimately lost their jobs. You still have people who've been without income of a regular sort for a couple months. The government supplemented it. The challenge has been that that money has not really been able to go anywhere, and that's one of the reasons it hasn't been as stimulative as we expected it to be. It's a very traditional response to a recession is to throw money at it. And the notion is that the consumer will rescue the day and go out and spend money. The problem this time is that somewhere between 65 and 70% of our disposable income is spent on services. We don't really buy as much stuff as we think we do. We spend a lot of our money now on Starbucks coffee and on hair salons and play dates for kids and sporting events and you know going to play miniature golf. I don't know, just all kinds of different kinds of service type offerings, all of which have been shut down. So, where we normally as a country have a savings rate that is ridiculously low, we are often 4%, 5% of our income is saved. More years than not, we actually dissave. We spend more money than we make. Right now, the savings rate in the United States is over 14%. And it's not because we've suddenly become more frugal. It's just simply that there's nowhere to spend it. So when the economy begins to open up, that money theoretically will come flowing back into the economy. People will have accumulated money to spend. There are definitely people who had no opportunity to accumulate money. They're struggling to pay their rent, they're struggling to pay for their groceries, but a lot of people said, well, I had money in reserve. I've gotten money from the government. One of the concerns among the business community was that people who were getting unemployment and getting the benefits from the government were making more money than they would make if they went back to work. And I know of a lot of companies where the employees were turning to the boss and saying, please fire me. Because if you're taking this payroll protection money, trying to keep the payroll intact so you can keep paying me, well, that's a very noble gesture, but what you're paying me is less than what I can make from the government right now. The government is paying me all this extra cash. So do me a favor and fire me, bring me back later, but for now, let me draw from the government. And the businesses, therefore, have been a little less than enthusiastic about the payroll protection money because they're like, well, I'm going to have to pay it back if I don't maintain my payrolls, but my employees are looking at me like, don't do it. We make more money otherwise. And so it's kind of the law of unintended consequences. It was a nice gesture and it worked for lots of people, but for lots of other people, it hasn't. We have basically spent our money on all kinds of things, and you can see where the decline has been most obvious. Health and beauty, entertainment and restaurants, transportation, shopping, travel, all of those things have dropped like a stone, and that's the majority of what consumers spend on in any given time. We have really shifted in the last 10 or 15 years away from buying things and more towards buying services. And this is almost generational. Millennials are really heavy when it comes to services. They are not the collectors that boomers were. And I've been making this point for years, just in the normal course of giving presentations. The boomer was the collector. The boomer was the person who had the attitude that he who dies with the most stuff wins. And so it was the boomer that would buy a Harley just because they want to be able to tell people they have a Harley. The boomer is the one that wanted the big house. The boomer is the one that wanted all the toys. The millennials are like, no, I don't want all that stuff. Just too much junk to haul around. I just want to spend my money on stuff that is a service orientation. I want to go traveling. I want to hang out with my friends. I want to go to concerts. I want to spend money on kind of enjoying the moment. And that is what's been driving the economy for the last several years. A index that I work on for the National Association for Credit Management, I think I may have mentioned this in some of the previous webinars, but the NACM at one point was looking at the Purchasing Managers Index and said, why are purchasing managers famous and we're not? We are also laboring in the trenches down there in the basement. So we created an index that is extremely similar to the PMI, same diffusion index, same everything. And we ask credit managers questions about their world. The last 2 months have been disastrous. But what's interesting about the data that came in, we separate this index into two categories. There are favorables and unfavorables. The favorables, from a credit manager's perspective, include things like sales and applications for credit and dollar collections and the like. The unfavorables are disputes, accounts out for collection, um, bankruptcies, slow pays, things of that nature. All of the damage so far has been in the favorables. Most of the unfavorables are still hanging in there because there hasn't yet been time. You are not in collection danger yet because you had 120-day terms. You are not in bankruptcy danger yet. You are not really facing any of those down areas yet. You may if this carries on into the summer, but there might be time for companies to have recovered before they got into that level of trouble. Something else to obsess over. I just thought, we get tired of worrying about COVID-19. So if you want to spend some of your day worrying about something else, you can worry about our growing debt. This graph was done before we dumped $5 to $7 trillion into the economy. And you can see where spending was really taken off and revenues weren't. So that gap was widening already, and now it is really accelerating. And that could be a big problem for the future to contend with. Predictable outbreaks, we know where this is going to be a problem. Urban areas have been affected a lot more dramatically than areas that are less crowded, less exposed. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And one of the great concerns, which we'll talk about later, is when we sort of have the ultimate solution to any kind of viral outbreak. And that kind of shows up when we talk about risk factors. You know, the risk factors we know. The people who are over 60 still have a fatality rate that is very high compared to those under 50. Underlying health issues play a role. But some of the things that are playing a major role are not getting as much attention, partly because I don't know how the press has been informed when it comes to this, and there's a certain amount of, at the risk of some other term, almost political correctness. I mean, I've watched medical people kind of dance around the fact that, you know, people that are not in very good shape are more likely to be victimized. And it's like, well, just come out and say it. If you've not been taking care of yourself, you're vulnerable. The only way that this virus is defeated right now, since there are no cures and no vaccines, is your body fights it off. And if your body isn't strong, it's not going to fight it off. So it's one of those conversations that's kind of awkward to have, but we need to. And then one of the other concerns is fatigue. People who get run down are more vulnerable. And again, that's logical. We've all noticed that. I mean, every one of us at some point has gotten a cold or the flu. And when do we get colds and flus? When we have exhausted ourselves and we're more vulnerable. That's something that is intuitive. So as we kind of wind this up, the three scenarios regarding the outbreak, the most likely is that we'll have a series of outbreaks in specific areas, those areas with those vulnerable populations, urban areas. The next most likely would be waves of infections where there have been a loosening of restrictions. People who were not exposed now become exposed. And the least likely is that massive second wave that would be like the first wave. And the reason for that comes down to the notion of herd immunity. The Swedes have gone so far as to base their entire response on accelerating herd immunity. And epidemiologists basically say, look, at the end of the day, the only thing that really protects the world as a whole is herd immunity. There will be a point where 70 some percent of the population has had COVID-19. 3/5 of them will be asymptomatic. They'll never even know they had it. Another significant percentage will have a very mild version, but once they've had it, they will be at least temporarily immune, or at least most will be, just like with the flu. There are people that get the flu over and over again, but the majority of us get it and that we're done. We've now got the antibodies that recognize the virus and are ready, and they fight it when we are exposed to it again. Herd immunity is a very crude way of fighting a viral infection because it means that everybody has to get it. There has to be a lot of people that survive it. And then once you have lots of people who are surviving it, the virus doesn't spread because it keeps running into people that have had it and are no longer victimized by it. It's extremely difficult to kind of implement a policy based on herd immunity because it's more or less accepting that a certain percentage of people will get the disease in a serious way and die. Winners and losers, some of them are of great importance to the ASA membership. I mean, we've got things like automotive and construction and real estate. Oil is kind of being in both camps. There are some winners when it comes to oil and gas. There are going to be some losers. Education, financial services, less important to an ASA membership. Manufacturing, however, quite important. Potential winners, on the other hand, there are some important ones there as well. Agriculture is likely to do well. You're going to see a lot more attention to food processing and even retail. Medical supply, that kind of stuff. Probably not as big a deal for ASA members in e-commerce and telecoms, but even in things like manufacturing and construction, it's going to depend on a sector. Some will grow, some won't. For example, in construction, there's a lot more emphasis now on warehousing. People are very worried about their supply chains, and so they're deciding to carry a lot more inventory than they used to. In the manufacturing sector, not a lot of activity in aerospace, not a lot of activity in automotive, but all of a sudden agricultural manufacturing is beginning to show some signs of life. So it's still very sector driven, and it's also reflective of how bad a particular outbreak is in a particular part of the country. And so with that, life is altered. The coronavirus. How introverts think it is, they have training their whole life for this. They're like, I can't be more excited. Extroverts, the world has come to an end. They're just going to sit in their room and just cry. The media is portraying it like a zombie movie. All the buildings will crumble and will be eaten by large birds. But how it really is, we're now fighting each other for toilet paper. So that's going to be the world we inhabit. And we'll take some questions, but we want to thank our supplier partners first.
Thank you, Chris. This marks the end of a phenomenal series with Dr. Kuehl. Thank you, Chris, for all your efforts in making this 5-part COVID-19 economic impact webinar series a success. And again, we thank our supplier partners for the continued support of ASA and the PHCP and PVF industry. We will now be taking questions. Please post your questions in the question box. And as always, I will be sending out a satisfaction survey to all the attendees. Please fill it out and let us know if we should continue this trend of economic webinars on a periodic basis for you. Your feedback is paramount in ASA providing you with resources that enable you to make informed business decisions. I'll just be waiting for questions now.
And while we're waiting for questions, I'll throw my 2 cents in. It's like, you all know that you want to continue to see COVID cartoons. So, you know, you're going to want to see a webinar later when we're all doing well again. So I hope to be able to do a webinar later in the summer that said, wow, that was awful, but now we're doing so much better. So.
I know, right? I hope we do a webinar like that sooner than later, believe me.
Yep.
We might not have as many attendees though.
That's true. They'll be busy working. That's
yeah,
the good
they'll be busy working, feeling happier and more elevated, believe me.
Yep.
And the concept of herd immunity is a pretty interesting concept. I've been doing my own research on it. It's nice.
Yeah.
That you mentioned it.
Yep. And I think, as I kind of alluded to in the very beginning, one of the conversations going forward is, what do we do next time? We know there's going to be a next time because we've had viral outbreaks like this every year. And this one had characteristics that made it harder to deal with, but it won't be the last. And we're going to have to think through, what could we have done? What will we want to do in the future? We'll be looking at countries to see what their experiences tell us. Right now, Sweden is kind of the lab rat for Europe because they've decided not to shut down. And one of the things that they're counting on is that everybody else gets hit with that secondary wave, and they don't.
I've heard even Taiwan didn't really do a hard lockdown. The schools remained open. I don't know, I've heard that the concept was a bit similar to Sweden, but I'm not really sure about it.
Yeah, and it just kind of, the whole argument ends up being won over the efficacy of herd immunity, and that's a hard thing for a politician or a policymaker to even suggest, because it's basically saying, well, we're going to sacrifice a bunch of you for the benefit of the rest of us. And that may be realistic, but it's really hard to say in public.
I know, that's true. Okay, we have a question. We have heard from other economists that prior to COVID-19, we were heading for a Great Depression at the end of this decade due to the deficit. Would COVID accelerate this? Do you believe the Great Depression to be a possibility?
Yeah, I don't think that we're really going to face that kind of a recession. The idea that the deficit was going to create a recessionary atmosphere is probably inaccurate because we're in a very weird position when it comes to maintaining a deficit. As long as we can sell T-bills, we can fund whatever we want to do. It just becomes expensive, and every year we end up spending a lot of money on debt service, which we would not have to do if our deficit wasn't so high. What a lot of economists are now looking at is that this recession has probably eliminated the potential for another one anytime soon. That the damage that will have been done and then the recovery that comes later kind of cleanses the system. And instead of having the recession later this decade, we've had it now. And that kind of immunizes us in a way for another few years. Even those that have been fairly negative, like the Bolio brothers, had been predicting something dramatic by 2025, 26, somewhere in that range.
Wow. Okay.
They have
Mm-hmm.
now said, nope, we're not going to get it. This shot the wad. So we're in a position now where we're just going to be recovering from this recession, and that kind of cleansed the palate for the rest of the decade.
Right. Okay, we'll just be waiting for more questions. Okay, they're coming on the way. They're being typed.
Very good. And I'm probably going to
As
have
it,
to take some of the questions offline. I've got
that's
another
fine.
exciting webinar coming up, but the last time we did this, we had several people send in questions, and then Aisha sent them to me, and you were able to get a just as lengthy conversation in writing as you would get in person. So if we don't,
Yep.
for whatever reason, get to your question, we will pick it up later.
Yes, I was able to send back the answers to the people who asked the questions, so
Great.
we're good on that front. Okay, what is the climate for construction lending?
Construction lending so far seems to be hanging in there. The banks have been talking about where they're going to put their emphasis, and the banks have continued to say that they have a reasonable expectation that construction will continue, particularly on the commercial side. They're a little more worried when it comes to the household construction. They're enthusiastic more or less about single homes, but they're also noticing that the multifamily project and senior living is a lot less popular than it was 2 months ago. People are just not as enthusiastic about concentration of population. So commercial side should be in good shape. Single family housing should be in decent shape, but multifamily housing is going to be down.
Right. Okay. Another one is asking, when I do my math on herd immunity, I end up with several million deaths. How
Yeah.
many deaths do you calculate at herd immunity, and do you think society would sustain that level of loss?
Yeah, it's going to be a really difficult call. The Swedes have so
Yeah.
far noticed that the fatality rate has not gone up as high as originally estimated. Their epidemiologists had some pretty grim predictions, which have not turned out to be the case. And what it comes down to
Mm.
is that the vulnerable population, even in Sweden, was protected, and it seems to be
Yeah.
part of the proviso with any kind of herd immunity approach is that you take the elderly, you take the people who have compromised health, and you continue to isolate them,
Yeah.
and then you sort of let the herd immunity thing work its way through a healthier
Hmm.
population. But where you've
Right.
had societies that have left that vulnerable population exposed, the
Hmm.
fatality rates are too high. And that's probably going to be ongoing in terms of new protocols and new rules.
Yes, I remember reading about it, and apparently the nursing homes were put under lockdowns,
Right.
right, in Sweden, but 50% of the total deaths were from the nursing homes.
Yep. Yep.
You
It's
know.
basically, you're dealing with a population that just simply, and that's sort of been the unspoken challenge with all of this is that you're talking about a population that is vulnerable to all kinds of things. And this has been predicted for a long time, but without a lot of solution. Basically, we live a lot longer. And as a result, we have people in their 80s and 90s who have lived far longer than they would have lived 20, 30 years ago, which means now they're more vulnerable to all sorts of things, everything from cancer to heart disease, diabetes, whatever. And it is not surprising that they succumb, but perhaps what's more surprising is that they haven't succumbed by now. And that's a lot of people that are in gerontology are like, well, we have gotten a lot more longevity than we thought we would by now, but it's kind of come at a price because those people are weaker than they would have been 20, 30 years ago.
Which is sad. Okay, the next question is something that I can answer. Is it possible to see the recorded versions of prior webinars by Dr. Kuehl? We have all the recordings up on our website under My ASA. And in fact, they're even on the Coronavirus Resource Center. Without logging in, you can go and watch them. The presentations are available on My ASA only. You will need to log in to ASA in order to access the presentation, the slide deck. Okay, next question coming on.
I'm going to have to beg off because I need to jump on to my next exciting webinar, but please collect the messages and questions and I will respond to them.
Got it.
Thanks
no
very
problem.
much.
Thank you so much, Chris, for all that you did for us, and we'll see you soon again. Thank you to everyone who tuned in for the webinar. I will be sending out a brief satisfaction survey. Please fill it out and let us know if we should continue with the trend of more economic webinars. All the questions that I receive now, I will forward them to Chris, and once I receive responses, I will send the answers to the people who asked the questions. Thank you everyone for tuning in again, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye-bye.